As of 2023, Saudi Arabia has a population of about 37 million people. About 80% of every resident in the country lives within just one of these two narrow straight lines. One running directly along the country's west coast by the Red Sea, and the other running directly across the center of the country between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Outside of these two lines, the rest of the country for the most part is basically completely empty, with some of the most separately populated areas that can be found anywhere on the planet. So how did this weird situation in Saudi Arabia actually came to be? First of all, it's extremely important for you to understand that Saudi Arabia's territory and probably a lot bigger than you think it is. The country is the 12th largest in the entire world. It's a really big area. And even with 37 million people who live there, now it's still a pretty separately populated country overall. But the whole 37 million people think there is an incredibly recent development for nearly all of the human history until the late 20th century. The population of the country was only a tiny fraction of what it is today, because Saudi Arabia encompasses one of the least hospitable and most dangerous environment to humankind that can be found anywhere on our planet. The fact that so many people live there today is purely a product of spirit against nature. With a little help from modern technology, you see Saudi Arabia encompasses most of the geographic Arabian Peninsula, and the interior of this peninsula is nearly completely dominated by deserts. The largest of them are the technically separate Al Nufud Desert in the north, straining the border with Jordan and Iraq, which is connected via a narrow corridor, Rab al Khali Desert, which is better known in English as simply the Empty Quarter. And then outside of the empty quarters and the Al Nufud are not much better lands from a human settlement perspective either. Saudi Arabia is also the largest country in the world that does not have a single permanent river to be found anywhere within its territory. And nearby Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain and Kuwait all does not have any rivers within any of their territories either. The closest river that can be found to Saudi Arabia are the Jordan River running through Jordan and the Euphrates River running through Iraq. And at the exact same time, rainfall is also extremely scarce within Saudi Arabia as well because of the country's unique topography and geographical setting. Jeddah became an important coastal port city, but it's on flat land at sea level where the temperature obviously can get swelterly hot. Mecca sits about 80 kilometers further inland and further up into the surrounding hills at about 275 meters high up in elevation. And some of the mountains around the city soar to over 1800 meters high above the sea level, about as high as the tallest mountain that are seen in the Appalachians in United States, which obviously offers up a tremendous amount of reprieve from the hottest temperatures seen lower down in Jeddah. But once you cross through or over the mountain ranges here in the west of the country, it's pretty much just entirely low and flat elevation all the way across the rest of Arab, clear to the Persian Gulf in the east. The area in Arab around the Persian Gulf suffers from literally the most oppressive combination of humidity and heat that can be found anywhere in the world. And it is one of the very few places where this combination can actually reach lethal levels. You see, in environments that are both hot and humid, it steadily becomes more and more challenging for humans to cool down their body temperature through sweating, because it is more difficult to transfer heat to warm wet air than warm dry air. When the combination of heat and humidity exceeds 95 Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius and 100% humidity, any human being, even one who is fit and healthy, will die within hours if they are out in the open and not properly clothed. Virtually everyone across most of Arab lived a nomadic life right up into the mid-20th century, and at the turn of the 20th century, all of Saudi Arabia's current land mass probably only had around 2 million people living within it. And nearly all of them lived just in the extreme west of the country along the narrow Red Sea coastal plains within the first line of Saudi Arabia's population pattern. The second line of Saudi Arabia's modern population core running across the center of the country through lands that were basically uninhabitable wetland for all of human history only came to existence in the later half of the 20th century for a couple of very big reasons. The first is because the Riyadh was historically the ancestral seat of the House of Saud, who thought a series of conquests across the early 20th century managed to carve out the modern state of Saudi Arabia as we know it today. When the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was first proclaimed in 1932, the Sauds made Riyadh the new kingdom's capital, not only because it was their own ancestral home and seat, but because there were very few other alternatives. At the time in 1932, Riyadh was nothing but a small town home to only about 27 7,000 people. Makkah was probably the biggest city in the country back then with a population of around 80,000, but neither Makkah nor Medina could possibly be selected as the kingdom's capital because of the prohibition of non-Muslims, who are forbidden from ever being able to enter either of the two holy cities, which would be a big problem for hosting foreign diplomats in either of them from non-Muslim countries. Riyadh was more centrally located within the middle of the country as well, and so Riyadh was selected to be the new country's capital. It was very fortunate that shortly after that decision in 1938, the largest oil fields in the entire world were discovered just to the east of Riyadh, near to the Persian Gulf. After those oil fields were developed and after the price of oil quadrupled following the 1973 oil crisis, Riyadh flourished owing to its proximity to the fields, and new cities and urban areas in the east of Saudi Arabia right on top of the fields exploded in population as the demand for jobs there skyrocketed out of nowhere. The modern city of Dammam here was only first settled by humans in 1923, and it was the location of the first oil discovered in Saudi Arabia a decade and a half later in 1938. It eventually became the core of the entire state-owned Saudi oil business and grew from being completely uninhabited in 1923 to a big urban metropolitan area of around 2.2 million people today, only a century later. Competing with Las Vegas and Nevada for the title of biggest city in the world that was only settled in 20th century, indeed Saudi Arabia at large utterly exploded in population as wealth from the oil business came flooding into the kingdom after 1973. And the kingdom used the money to become one of the largest welfare states in the world for all its citizens. No personal income tax was levied on anyone, while healthcare, housing, fuel, electricity, water and food were all massively subsidized by the government for everyone, because there was just so much money coming in from oil. But the Saudi citizens themselves were far too few in numbers to assume all of the necessary jobs that were being created. And in this environment where nearly all of their needs were being met by the government, many of them did not necessarily see the point in working at a job. A labor shortage grew immediately apparent within the kingdom as soon as the 1950s, and to help overcome it, the kingdom began a process of mass importation of so-called guest workers from abroad into the country for every one Saudi citizen worker. As of 2023, it's estimated that roughly 36% of the kingdom's total overall population are non-citizen foreigners born outside of the kingdom, nearly twice the ratio of foreigners currently present within the United States. And the vast majority of them in Saudi Arabia are the very low-paid guest workers from developing countries. It's estimated that there is only about 100,000 Westerners who currently live in the kingdom, and they are treated vastly superior. But because of all these factors combined, Saudi Arabia literally became the fastest urbanizing and the fastest developing society that has ever been witnessed in all of human history. 37 million people living within Saudi Arabia today is extremely problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's likely not going to be very sustainable for the long term, because there are obviously a ton of problems created by Saudi Arabia's currently massive population in one of the least hospitable environments on the planet. Saudi Arabia needs to completely and radically transform itself even further if it is to ever survive the 21st century. And if it does not and it fails, then 37 million people and probably more in the future will suddenly find that they cannot actually survive in an over-engineered wasteland that has been completely inhospitable to human life for millennia, and most of them will all have to go somewhere else.